Sometimes the hardest words to hear are not, I don't love you. They are, I love you. But, because everything after but slowly teaches you to doubt yourself. It makes you question your worth, your patience, your silence, your strength. Today, this is not about blaming anyone. This is about understanding why we stay, why we hope, and why we accept half love when we deserve whole truth. If you've ever felt torn between love and self-respect, between holding on and letting go, this message is for you. Because real strength isn't in enduring pain quietly. Real strength is in choosing yourself, even when love makes that choice feel impossible. Let's talk about overcoming I love you, but, and reclaiming the peace you were never meant to lose. I love you, but. Those 4 words sound gentle at first, almost caring. They arrive wrapped in honesty, or at least that's how they present themselves. They pretend to be truth. They pretend to be bravery. And because of that, we listen. We lean in. We soften. We believe the person saying them is being real with us. But what those words really do is create a pause where certainty used to live. They interrupt love with a condition. They take something that should be whole and quietly divide it into parts. When someone says, I love you, but they're not ending love, they're reshaping it. They're redefining it in a way that gives them comfort while asking you to adjust. And at first, you do adjust. You tell yourself that love isn't perfect, that people aren't perfect, that compromise is normal. You convince yourself that this is just how grown-up love works. You think maturity means endurance. You think patience means silence. You think loyalty means staying even when something inside you starts to feel smaller. The first time you hear it, it doesn't hurt much. It sounds reasonable, maybe even responsible. I love you, but I need space. I love you, but I'm not ready. I love you, but you're too sensitive. You don't hear rejection. You hear possibility. You hear hope. You hear something that feels unfinished rather than final. And unfinished things are dangerous because the human heart hates loose ends. It wants resolution. It wants completion. It wants to believe that if it just waits a little longer, tries a little harder, becomes a little quieter or a little stronger, the sentence will eventually end without the but. So you stay. You stay because leaving would mean accepting that love, as you imagined it, might never arrive. You stay because walking away feels like giving up. And you don't want to be someone who gives up on love. You stay because you remember the good moments, the laughs, the calm nights, the version of them that made you feel seen, at least sometimes. You stay because you think love is about understanding, and understanding means forgiving things that don't sit right yet. But every time the word but appears, something shifts. It shifts quietly, almost politely. It doesn't scream. It doesn't demand. It just nudges you slightly away from yourself, and you barely notice it happening. You start editing your reactions. You choose words more carefully. You pause before expressing how you feel, running your emotions through an internal filter that asks, is this too much? You begin to apologize for feelings you haven't fully expressed yet. You pre-shrink your needs so they fit into the space you're allowed. And the most confusing part is that you're still being told you're loved. That's what makes it so hard to leave. You're not being pushed away entirely. You're being held at arm's length, close enough to stay, far enough to feel uncertain. And uncertainty has a strange power over people who care deeply. It keeps them trying. It keeps them hopeful. It keeps them investing energy into proving their worth, choosing without conditions. Over time, love starts to feel like a test you didn't know you signed up for. You start measuring yourself through their reactions. If they're distant, you assume you did something wrong. If they're quiet, you replay conversations in your head, searching for mistakes. If they pull back, you lean forward. You begin working harder for something that once felt effortless. And the more effort you put in, the more invested you become, which makes the idea of leaving feel heavier, more complicated, more painful. I love you, but I can't give you what you want right now. That sentence sounds honest. It sounds fair. And honesty is usually something we respect. But honesty without responsibility can still cause damage. Because when someone knows they can't meet you where you are, yet chooses to stay anyway, they're asking you to do the emotional labor for both of you. They're asking you to carry the uncertainty, the waiting, the adjustment, while they remain comfortable in not having to change. And you tell yourself you're strong enough to handle it. You tell yourself you can wait. You tell yourself that love is patient. You tell yourself that timing matters, that life is complicated, that nobody owes you anything. You repeat these ideas until they start sounding like truth instead of coping mechanisms. You start defending the situation to yourself and to others. You become the translator for someone else's emotional limitations. What you don't notice at first is how quiet you're becoming inside. Not quiet in a peaceful way. Quiet in a way that feels like you're slowly disappearing from your own life. You still function, you still smile, you still show up, but parts of you feel muted, like they are behind glass. You feel less spontaneous, less expressive, less sure of yourself. You hesitate more, you question more. You feel a constant need to be careful, to not push too much, to not ask for clarity too often, to not risk being the reason the but becomes permanent. And somewhere along the way, love stops feeling like a place you rest and starts feeling like a place you perform. You perform understanding. You perform patience. You perform strength. You perform being low maintenance. And people praise you for it. They tell you how mature you are, how calm, how supportive. They don't see the nights where you sit with questions that never get answered. They don't see the moments where you want to speak but choose silence because it feels safer. They don't see how often you negotiate with your own needs, telling yourself they can wait a little longer. I love you, but this is just how I am. That sentence carries weight. It presents itself as acceptance, as self-awareness. And in some ways, it is. People are allowed to be who they are. But when "this is how I am" consistently hurts you, confuses you, or makes you feel unseen, it stops being a neutral fact and starts being a boundary you're expected to adapt to. And adaptation becomes your responsibility, not theirs. You start bending without realizing how far you're leaning. You tell yourself that love isn't supposed to be easy. That struggle is part of growth. That discomfort means you're learning something. And sometimes that's true. But there's a difference between growing together and shrinking yourself to fit into someone else's limitations. Growth expands you. Shrinking slowly erases you. The hardest part is that there's no clear villain in this story. No one is shouting. No one is intentionally cruel. No one is outright leaving. And because of that, you feel like you don't have the right to be hurt. You feel like your pain needs justification. You feel guilty for wanting more when you're already being given something. You tell yourself that partial love is better than none, that something is better than nothing, that at least they're honest. But honesty doesn't automatically equal kindness. And love without presence isn't the same as love that shows up. You begin to realize that the word "but" is always followed by something that asks you to wait, to lower your expectations, or to accept less than what your heart keeps quietly asking for. And even though no one is forcing you to stay, you feel trapped by your own hope. You're trapped by the version of the future you keep imagining. You're trapped by the belief that leaving would mean you failed, that you didn't try hard enough, that you didn't love deeply enough. So you keep loving. You love through confusion. You love through absence. You love through inconsistency. You love through moments where you feel like an option instead of a priority. And you call it loyalty. You call it depth. You call it commitment. You don't realize that love should not require you to constantly explain why you deserve clarity, reassurance, or consistency. I love you, but I don't know what I want. That sentence leaves you suspended. It gives you no direction, no timeline, no ground to stand on. And yet, you stay balanced on it, trying not to fall, You tell yourself that knowing what you want takes time. That pressure is unfair, that everyone is figuring things out. And all of that might be true. But while they're figuring themselves out, you're slowly unlearning how to trust your own feelings. You stop asking direct questions because the N you swears are always vague. You stop expecting follow through because it rarely comes. You stop imagining a future out loud because it feels embarrassing to want something the other person can't picture with you. You begin living in the present, not because it's peaceful, but because the future feels too uncertain to touch, and the present starts feeling smaller too, because presence without security is exhausting. You're always alert, always reading tone, always scanning for signs, always wondering where you stand, and love becomes less about connection and more about interpretation. You analyze texts, you analyze pauses, you analyze changes in energy. You become fluent in reading between the lines, even when there shouldn't be lines to read between. The but keeps you working, it keeps you proving, keeps you adjusting, and it keeps the other person comfortable in knowing they don't have to fully choose or fully leave. They get companionship without commitment, intimacy without responsibility, connection without clarity, and you get the task of holding everything together emotionally, even when you're the one with the most to lose. At some point, you start wondering when love became something you had to earn. You think about who you were before this, how freely you laughed, how openly you spoke, how naturally you trusted, and you don't recognize that version of yourself as easily anymore. Not because you're weaker, but because you've been spending so much energy holding space for someone else's uncertainty that you haven't had much left for yourself. I love you, but you deserve better than me. That sentence sounds selfless. It sounds like concern, but often it's a way of stepping back without stepping away. It places the responsibility of leaving on you. It frames your pain as something inevitable rather than something that could be addressed. And if you don't leave, it quietly confirms that you've accepted the terms. And you hesitate because walking away from someone who admits their limitations feels cruel. Because leaving someone who says they love you feels wrong. Because choosing yourself feels selfish when you've been practicing self-sacrifice for so long. You've confused endurance with depth. You've confused patience with love. And untangling those ideas takes more courage than staying ever did. You begin to see that love shouldn't constantly feel like something you're waiting for. It shouldn't live in potential instead of reality. It shouldn't make you question whether your needs are reasonable. It shouldn't ask you to be less so someone else can stay comfortable being more. Love doesn't need a disclaimer. It doesn't need a footnote. It doesn't need a but to explain why it can't fully show up. And this realization doesn't arrive loudly. It comes quietly, in small moments. In the tiredness you feel after another conversation that goes nowhere. In the way your chest tightens when you think about asking for clarity again. In the way you stop sharing certain thoughts because you already know how they'll be received. It comes in the silence you feel even when you're not alone. You realize that love, our real love, doesn't leave you constantly negotiating with yourself. And once you see that, it becomes harder to unsee. You start noticing how often you excuse behavior that hurts you, how often you minimize your own feelings, how often you accept uncertainty as the price of connection, and you begin to understand that the sentence, I love you, but, has been shaping your self-worth more than you realized. Because every time you accepted the but, you taught yourself that love is something that comes with conditions you must meet, moods you must manage, and limits you must respect, even when those limits leave you emotionally hungry. And slowly, quietly, without drama, you begin to question whether love that requires you to abandon yourself is love at all. I love you, but you're too much. Sometimes it's not said that directly. Sometimes it's wrapped in softer language. You overthink. You feel too deeply. You make things complicated. But the message lands the same. It tells you that the way you experience the world is excessive, that your emotions arrive louder than they should, that your needs take up more space than is convenient for someone else. And at first, you don't argue with it. You pause, you reflect, you look inward. You ask yourself if maybe they're right. You replay moments in your head, trying to see yourself from their perspective. You don't want to be unfair. You don't want to be dramatic. You don't want to be the reason something beautiful becomes difficult. So you soften, you adjust, you tell yourself you can learn to be calmer, quieter, easier to love. I love you, but I need you to change. That sentence doesn't always sound like rejection. Sometimes it sounds like advice. Sometimes it sounds like concern. Sometimes it sounds like growth. And because growth is something we admire, we listen. We convince ourselves that love should challenge us, that relationships are mirrors, that discomfort means transformation. And while some discomfort is part of becoming better, there's a difference between growing and erasing yourself to be tolerated. You begin trimming parts of who you are, not all at once. That would be obvious. It happens slowly. You stop bringing up certain topics because they lead to tension. You stop expressing disappointment because it's labeled as negativity. You stop asking questions because they're seen as pressure. You tell yourself it's not worth it. You tell yourself peace matters more than being understood. And you don't realize that the peace you're choosing is one-sided. The word "but" becomes a tool. It creates a hierarchy where their comfort sits above your truth, where their pace determines your patience, where their boundaries are firm and yours are flexible. You learn that if you want love to stay, you have to stay agreeable. You learn that resistance leads to distance, and distance feels like punishment, so you adapt. I love you, but I can't handle this right now, so you carry it alone. You hold your emotions quietly. You process privately. You become your own support system, even though you're in a relationship. You stop expecting emotional presence because expecting leads to disappointment. You stop reaching out because reaching out leads to withdrawal. You become skilled at self-soothing, not because you want to be independent, but because you don't feel safe needing someone who keeps stepping back. And when you finally do speak, when the weight becomes too heavy to hold alone, you're told you're bringing things up again, that you're reopening old conversations, that you're not letting things go. And you start wondering if your memory is the problem, if your persistence is the issue, if wanting resolution means you're stuck in the past. But unresolved feelings don't disappear just because they make someone uncomfortable. They settle, they sink, they turn inward. And when emotions don't have a place to land, they don't dissolve. They reshape you from the inside. You become more cautious, more guarded, less expressive. You start doubting your instincts. You stop trusting your emotional reactions because they've been framed as excessive. I love you, but you take things too personally. So you stop taking things personally, not because they stop hurting, but because acknowledging the hurt feels pointless. You tell yourself it's not intentional. You tell yourself they don't mean it that way. You translate their distance into neutrality, their inconsistency into stress, their silence into needing space. You become fluent in interpretation. You become patient in ways that slowly drain you. And you don't notice the cost right away. The cost shows up in subtle ways, in how tired you feel after conversations that go nowhere, in how anxious you become before bringing something up, in how you rehearse what you're going to say, trying to remove anything that might sound like an accusation, in how you apologize before you even begin speaking, just to soften the ground. I love you, but I'm just not good at emotions. So you stop expecting emotional fluency, you lower the bar, you accept half responses, you accept delayed reactions, you accept silence as a response, you accept confusion as normal, and you tell yourself that everyone expresses love differently, that actions matter more than words, that not everyone can give reassurance easily. You become understanding to the point where understanding costs you clarity. And clarity is something the human heart needs. Without it, you live in a constant state of anticipation, waiting to see where you stand, waiting to see if today is a good day or a distant one, waiting to see if connection will feel easy or strained. And waiting becomes a habit. You learn how to live in uncertainty because certainty feels out of reach. I love you, but you're asking for too much. That sentence reshapes your needs into demands. It makes you question whether wanting consistency is unreasonable, whether wanting reassurance is needy, whether wanting presence is unrealistic. You start comparing yourself to an imaginary standard of someone who would be easier to love, someone who wouldn't need as much, someone who wouldn't feel as deeply. And you begin measuring your worth against that version. You tell yourself you should be grateful. Grateful they're still here. Grateful they're trying. Grateful they're honest. Grateful they haven't left. And gratitude becomes another way you silence yourself. Because how can you complain when someone is still choosing you, even partially? How can you ask for more when you're already receiving something? But love isn't measured by fragments. It's not supposed to feel like a ration. It's not supposed to make you feel guilty for wanting to feel secure. And yet, you keep adjusting. You keep negotiating. You keep shrinking the parts of yourself that seem to cause friction. You think love is about meeting someone where they are, even if where they are doesn't leave room for you. I love you, but this is all I can give. That sentence sounds final. It sounds like a truth you're supposed to accept, and maybe it is true. Maybe that really is all they can give. But the part that goes unspoken is what that means for you. It means you're being asked to live within limits that don't align with your emotional capacity. It means you're being asked to settle into a version of love that keeps you constantly adjusting. And you tell yourself you can handle it. You tell yourself that wanting more doesn't mean you deserve more. You tell yourself that expectations ruin relationships. You tell yourself that love isn't about keeping score. And while all of that can be true, it becomes dangerous when it's used to justify staying in a dynamic that consistently leaves you feeling unseen. You begin to notice how often you're the one compromising, how often you're the one understanding, how often you're the one waiting, how often you're the one explaining why something matters. And you start wondering when love became something that only flows in one direction emotionally. I love you, but you're too intense. Intensity becomes a flaw instead of a depth. You stop sharing your inner world. You stop expressing excitement too loudly. You stop caring too visibly. You dull your edges so they don't feel overwhelmed. And you don't realize that the very things being labeled as too much are often the things that make you deeply human. Your sensitivity, your awareness, your emotional honesty, these are not weaknesses. But in the wrong environment, they start to feel like liabilities. You begin to see yourself as someone who needs to be managed rather than understood. And that changes how you see yourself. You start thinking maybe love would be easier if you were different, quieter, less expressive, less affected. You start imagining a version of yourself that would fit better into their comfort zone. And the more you imagine that version, the more distant you feel from who you actually are. I love you, but you're making this hard. So you try to make it easier. You become flexible. You become accommodating. You become patient beyond reason. You start absorbing discomfort so the relationship can feel smooth on the surface. And on the surface, it might look calm, but beneath that calm is a steady erosion of self-trust. You stop trusting your reactions because they've been framed as problems. You stop trusting your needs because they've been labeled as pressure. You stop trusting your intuition because it keeps telling you something is missing, and you've been taught that wanting more is asking too much. The but doesn't just erase self-worth loudly. It erases it quietly, through repetition, through subtle messages, through patterns that teach you to associate love with self-restraint. with emotional moderation, with constant self-monitoring. And over time, you forget what it feels like to be fully yourself without fear of being too much. You forget what it feels like to be loved without editing. And one day, you notice how tired you are. Not tired from life, tired from holding back, tired from choosing words carefully, tired from carrying emotional weight alone, tired from constantly trying to be understood by someone who keeps telling you they love you while simultaneously asking you to be less of who you are. That tiredness doesn't come with anger at first. It comes with sadness, with quiet grief, with the realization that you've been negotiating your worth in small ways for a long time. And that realization hurts more than any argument ever did, because you see it clearly now. The problem was never that you were too much. The problem was that you were giving depth to someone who could only handle surface. And instead of recognizing the mismatch, you were taught to blame yourself for feeling deeply. You begin to understand that love should not require you to dim your emotional range. It should not ask you to become smaller to remain connected. It should not make you feel like your needs are inconveniences. And once you understand that, the word but loses some of its power. You start hearing it differently. Not as honesty, not as growth, not as something you need to fix, but as information. Information about limits, about capacity, about alignment. And you begin to realize that loving someone doesn't mean you have to accept a version of love that slowly teaches you to disappear. And this understanding doesn't immediately tell you what to do. It simply sits with you. It lingers. It makes it harder to unfeel what you feel, harder to unsee what you've seen. And even if you stay, something inside you has shifted, because you know now that love should not come with a constant request for self-erasure, choosing self-respect without anger. It starts quietly, almost imperceptibly, a feeling that nudges at you in small ways, a hesitation before speaking, a pause before offering affection, a growing awareness that your needs matter. You notice that every time you bend, every time you shrink, every time you compromise your boundaries for someone else's comfort, a small piece of yourself is quietly set aside, and you begin to ask a question that feels unfamiliar. What does it mean to honor yourself in the midst of love? Self-respect isn't loud. It doesn't demand. It doesn't appear in dramatic gestures or declarations. It begins as a stillness, a recognition that your feelings, your time, your energy, and your presence have value beyond what anyone else decides to give them. You realize that respect is not something only others grant you. It's a practice, a choice, a commitment to yourself. And you notice how often, in love, that choice has been postponed, deferred, or ignored. You start observing patterns. The times when you said yes because saying no felt like rejection. The moments when you silenced your voice to avoid tension. The occasions when you minimized your dreams, your desires, your emotions, because they were inconvenient to someone else's reality. You see how frequently self-respect was the quiet casualty of maintaining connection, of keeping love intact, of avoiding conflict. And then a strange thing happens. You realize that respect and anger are not the same. Self-respect does not require resentment. Choosing to honor yourself does not mean punishing others for their limitations. It is possible to value your own well-being while remaining compassionate toward another person. This is the paradox that feels revolutionary, that you can step into your own boundaries without stepping on someone else, that you can claim your space without claiming blame, that you can rise without tearing anyone else down. Choosing self-respect begins with clarity. You start to notice where your needs have been ignored or dismissed, where compromise has felt unequal, where love has demanded that you be less than you are. And this noticing is not judgment, it is acknowledgement. It is seeing the truth of your own experience and understanding that a life lived honoring your limits is not selfish, it is necessary. It is a declaration that your emotional survival matters, that your well-being matters, that your inner peace matters, and that no one else's approval is required to validate that. You practice saying no softly at first, not with anger, not with force, but with certainty. You notice how the word feels in your mouth, how it shapes your posture, how it creates room where there was none before, and you feel a strange freedom. You realize that boundaries are not walls, they are invitations for healthier connection. They are markers that distinguish love that nourishes from love that depletes. You recognize that choosing yourself is not rejection, it is clarity. And as you practice, subtle resistance appears. The voices of guilt, obligation, and fear rise quietly in your mind. Am I being too rigid? Am I selfish? Am I abandoning love? These questions are familiar, and for a moment you listen. But slowly, deliberately, you begin to untangle your inner narrative from the expectations of others. You examine the belief that caring for yourself diminishes care for others. You notice that your capacity to give, to nurture, to love is enhanced, not diminished, by honoring your own limits. You start to see the patterns in relationships that previously felt confusing. You recognize where compromise became erasure. You identify moments where love was conditional and where your presence was taken for granted. And you understand that choosing self-respect is not retaliation, it is protection. It is preservation of the self that must continue to grow and breathe, even in intimacy. There is a delicate tension between self-respect and vulnerability. You learn to hold both. You do not sacrifice your voice for connection, but you also do not close your heart out of fear. You allow yourself to care deeply while maintaining awareness of what is acceptable and what is harmful. You understand that boundaries are not punitive, they are preventative. They prevent the slow erosion of your dignity. They prevent patterns of imbalance from becoming normalized. Anger, you realize, is optional. It is a natural response to being disrespected, yes, but it is not required to claim your worth. Self-respect can be quiet, steady, and even compassionate. You can assert what you need without creating conflict. You can honor your time, your body, and your mind without bitterness. You can be firm without being hostile. And in this quiet firmness, you discover a strength you did not know you possessed. Every decision you make from this place reinforces your inner authority. You begin to notice the subtle ways you've compromised yourself in the past, saying yes when you wanted to say no, tolerating inconsistency, accepting uncertainty, remaining in situations that left you feeling small, and you start to respond differently, not angrily, not out of frustration, but with deliberate intention. You make choices that protect your energy, honor your truth, and cultivate your well-being. You notice how this shift ripples outward. Relationships respond to the clarity of your boundaries. People treat you differently when you no longer accept erosion of your dignity. Some will resist, some will test limits, some will pull away, and that's not your responsibility. Your responsibility is to yourself. Your responsibility is to maintain integrity in your own life, regardless of how others react. Choosing self-respect requires patience. It is not a single moment of decision, but a continual practice. Each day brings opportunities to reinforce your limits, to speak your truth, to prioritize your well-being. You learn to honor small victories, saying no to requests that overextend you, asserting your opinion in discussions, taking time for rest, refusing to carry burdens that are not yours. And each act of self-honor strengthens your capacity to remain both compassionate and firm. You notice the subtle changes inside yourself. A calm replaces anxiety. Confidence grows quietly. Decisions feel lighter, less forced. Your energy is no longer dispersed in constant negotiation or silent accommodation. You begin to recognize the difference between love that nourishes and love that depletes. And this recognition does not come with harsh judgment, but with clarity, with discernment, with insight that protects rather than punishes. You begin to understand that self-respect is also about the stories you tell yourself, about the internal dialogue that guides your reactions. You stop framing your needs as burdens. You stop labeling your emotions as inconvenient. You stop assuming that someone else's capacity dictates your value. And you start to tell yourself, I am enough, I am worthy, I am allowed to ask for what I need. I am allowed to protect my energy without apology. Compassion and self-respect coexist. You realize that honoring yourself does not require diminishing another person. You can be kind and clear, empathetic and firm. You can maintain warmth while upholding boundaries. And in this balance, you find a form of love that feels sustainable because it is grounded in truth and clarity, not in fear, guilt, or obligation. You notice how much lighter it feels to move through the world without carrying the weight of compromise that erases you. Your interactions are no longer filtered by anxiety or fear of rejection. You communicate openly, honestly, and authentically. You allow yourself to give generously, but you also allow yourself to receive with expectation of respect in return. The practice of self-respect is ongoing. It is tested constantly in moments of emotional tension, in decisions where you could either yield or assert. Each moment becomes a choice to honor your limits or to sacrifice them silently, and you learn to celebrate the times you choose yourself without guilt, without anger, without defensiveness. You recognize these moments as acts of courage, acts of integrity, acts of deep self-love, and in choosing self-respect without anger, you cultivate resilience. You develop an inner authority that is not contingent on external validation. You learn to respond to challenges from a place of centeredness rather than reactivity. You discover that your worth is inherent, independent of others' acknowledgement or approval. You recognize that the healthiest love is mutual, yes, but that it must also begin with self-respect. You realize that by valuing yourself, you invite others to value you as well. You teach through example, through calm assertiveness, through consistent boundaries, through compassionate firmness. You inspire respect not by demanding it, but by embodying it. And this embodiment radiates, influencing relationships, interactions, and the way you engage with the world. You see the contrast clearly, the past of compromise that quietly eroded your sense of self, the present of deliberate assertion, the future of sustainable, authentic engagement. You understand that choosing self-respect does not make you unlovable. It makes you visible. It allows you to participate in relationships as a whole person rather than a diminished version of yourself. You understand that boundaries are not obstacles to connection. They are facilitators. They enable intimacy built on mutual respect. They allow love to be free from manipulation, guilt, or coercion. They protect the heart from slow erosion while allowing it to flourish. And through this practice, you discover a profound truth that loving oneself is not a failure of compassion, but the foundation of all meaningful connection. You learn to distinguish between discomfort and danger, between challenge and compromise, between healthy growth and self-erasure. You recognize that your energy is finite and sacred, that your time is precious, that your emotional labor is not unlimited. And in honoring these truths, you cultivate a life where love can be mutual, sustainable, and life-affirming. And each day you practice, you strengthen the muscles of self-respect. You become more adept at identifying when you are being asked to diminish yourself. You become more skilled at saying no without resentment. You become more confident in standing firm while remaining compassionate. You become more capable of loving fully without sacrificing integrity. You see the patterns that once trapped you, the compromises, the self-neglect, the constant bending, and you recognize them as lessons, not failures. You acknowledge them, learn from them, and gently release their hold over your present choices. You cultivate awareness of the subtle ways self-respect can be overlooked, and you respond with deliberate intention to protect it. You notice that choosing self-respect does not require isolation. You can remain connected to others while maintaining boundaries. You can participate in love, friendship, and community while honoring your limits. You can remain open, kind, and generous without sacrificing your dignity. And this awareness transforms the quality of your relationships, the clarity of your communication, and the integrity of your inner life. You understand that self-respect is a lifelong practice. It requires ongoing attention, reflection, and courage. It requires willingness to notice discomfort and act on it. It requires clarity in distinguishing between what serves you and what diminishes you. And with each choice, each assertion, each act of honoring yourself, you cultivate a life that is both compassionate and grounded, both generous and discerning, both loving and fiercely protective of your own well being.